It's the summer of 1996, and I am in 5th grade and 11 years old. My parents have shipped me off for the week to a week-long church summer camp out in the rolling foothills of western Iowa, where I, along with approximately 150 other kids in 5th and 6th grade, spend Monday through Friday going on hikes and playing games and swimming outdoors and sitting around a campfire each night singing songs about Jesus and occasionally farting. My camp counselor is a silly guy named Jason. He tells the funniest jokes that I think I've ever heard and is easily one of the coolest people I have ever met. He drives a Camaro and flirts with the women counselors, and when he doesn't like things, he says that they suck, which basically, for me in 5th grade, was the same as swearing. And at the end of the week, Jason takes our cabin group into a quiet corner of the campground, and he tells us how important it is for us to accept Jesus into our hearts. He reminds us that we do not know when we are going to die, and that the only way to be sure of where we are going when we die is to ask God for forgiveness. He tells us about hell, about how it is a place of eternal damnation and fire, and about how it feels like being stabbed all over, all the time, and how the screams of the damned can be heard night and day. And he takes off his wraparound Oakley sunglasses that he is mysteriously wearing in the middle of the night, and there are tears in this college freshman's eyes as he tells us that there is coming a day when we will each be judged by God, and that the only way to avoid hell is to say a special prayer. By now, all of the 5th grade boys in the room are just freaked out, and they're scared and they're surprised by Jason's vulnerability and the tears, and we are all crying for no reason at all. And we all bow our heads, and we repeat the words that he tells us to say, and we accept Jesus, some of us for the 1000th time that week, into our hearts. It's the spring of 2008, and I am a junior in college. I am in Santa Fe, New Mexico, at a week-long gathering of leaders from what will be known as the emergent church movement, or a group of Christians that are fed up with the institutional church, and they want to find a way to follow Jesus without organized religion. They drink wine, and they smoke pot, and they talk about Dorothy Day and Gandhi, and it's crazy. They have yoga classes and eat hummus and use actual swear words when they preach. And I am 20 years old, and I have just now begun to just deconstruct my complicated relationship with God. And all of it is just so new to me. I try almond butter for the first time. Things are nuts. And at one point, one of the big shot leaders of this totally decentralized, leaderless group is leading a conversation about how hell is a myth meant to control the masses. It's made up by the rich and the powerful to subdue the people. He goes on to say that there is no way that Jesus, or at least his Jesus, would ever judge anyone, because his Jesus isn't an a-hole. But he doesn't say a-hole, he says the full word because he is edgy. He tells us how love never, ever includes judgment. And it's time for us to shed the baggage of hell and damnation and embrace a Jesus that is all about love. And I am inspired. I used $25 of the $70 that I was able to scrape together for the week to buy his book later on that day. I'm sold. Eternal judgment, in my mind, is a lie. It's 1741, and I will not be born for another 89,849 days, give or take a few. A crowd has gathered in a small church in Enfield, Connecticut, where an itinerant preacher named Jonathan Edwards is set to deliver a sermon. He will be eventually known as one of the most prominent leaders of the Great Awakening, a revival movement within American Christianity. And at one point, he looks at the crowd and he says with his most angry, stern voice, "The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some other loathsome creature over the fire, abhors you, and is dreadfully provoked, and his wrath towards you burns like fire." And that is one of the tame parts of that sermon. And throughout the sermon, it's reported that people begin to moan and they cry out, "What must we do to be saved?" And the sermon, called "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," would go on to be printed and distributed throughout the American colonies. And its influence on the way that Christians, and really the larger culture in general, would come to think about eternal judgment and damnation and hell and heaven, can still be felt centuries later. It's the spring of 2019, just a few days before Easter. Fulfilling one of his campaign promises, President Trump has signed legislation effectively cutting off the asylum-seeking process and severely limiting immigration within the United States. And one of the consequences to this is a flood of people coming to Arizona's southern border from all over Central America seeking asylum. And the government, totally unable to handle the influx of people who need a place to stay and food to eat, looks to churches to help shoulder the massive burden that this is. And a clergy friend of mine, a pastor friend of mine at a church located near the Greyhound station near the I-17 in Glendale, invites my wife and I to come help feed and care for the hundreds of people that show up every night looking for assistance in their hour of need. And so every Saturday for almost a month and a half, before they're able to find more permanent and better solutions for the problem that they have, we wake up at 5:30 in the morning and we go to Walmart to buy apples and oranges and pancake mix and Folgers coffee, and we make our way over to Trinity UMC. And we quietly prepare food for the people, many of whom have arrived in the middle of the night, having just completed the intake process to become legal asylees. We feed them on flimsy styrofoam plates, and we offer up what little we can with the money that we are able to pull together. These people look weary, tired, scared. Many of them, in fact, most of them, have children with them. We give them shoelaces and socks because they had those taken away at the border. And after a few weeks of doing this work, I begin to sit down with some of the people who come through each week. It's a new group almost every night, and I convince a friend who speaks Spanish to interpret for me. I want to hear their stories, to know what would compel someone to take such a perilous journey with their children. And among others, a woman named Daniela gathers up her children, and she sits with me at a picnic table in the courtyard of this church. And she begins to tell her story. It's sometime around 85 CE. I will not be born for another 694,450 days, give or take. And the author of the book of Matthew has just completed his gospel, which tells the story of the birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, who Matthew believes is to be the Savior of the world. And at one point, Matthew describes one of Jesus' final teachings before being whisked away into the events that would lead to his state-sponsored public execution. This fifth and final lesson given by Jesus to his closest followers and friends is one that is centered on the judgment of God. See, Jesus knows full well what is to follow for his disciples. That to follow in the way of love, as he is asking his disciples to do, is to come face to face with some of the darkest parts of humanity. That in caring for the poor and the sick and the destitute, the disciples will be confronted with the effects of evil within this world. That to seek and save the lost, they must go to the places where people become lost, a path that will inevitably lead some of them to their deaths. And what word of hope would Jesus have for them? What good news, what encouragement would he leave them with? And Jesus, looking out at his closest friends, at people he knows will die for this cause, takes a deep breath, and he begins his final teaching, the culmination of everything that he had shown them up until that point. It's 2019. Daniela tells me about her home. It's a small town of like 15,000 people in Guatemala. It's a place that is surrounded with lush green fields and rolling mountains. It's also a place of incredible violence and crime. In the past 2 years, Daniela tells me that she has lost 5 family members, all of them murdered for various reasons, sometimes randomly, sometimes intentionally. She knows injustice firsthand because the murderers were never found. No one even looked for them. And she tells me, to my horror, that this is actually very common in her area, that there is no accountability for anything, that it is every person for themselves, and it is the weak and the vulnerable that often suffer the most. She describes the difficulty of living in such a place, the fear that she had for her daughters and herself. And so she sold what little she had. She scraped together what little money she could, and she got onto a bus and she left for the one place that she was told that her family would be safe. Estados Unidos, the United States. And she described to me the journey that they had just come from, the journey that they were still on. The teeming crowds of people at the border, the camps, the hopelessness, the cruelty, the terrors of the unknown. She tells me about how her daughter, just 7 years old, got sick and was throwing up, and they were worried that they wouldn't let them in. And I would see then, through that conversation, that Daniela and her 2 daughters, I would understand better the suffering that they experienced, the anguish that they had known, which was really the pain of all the people we were serving Bisquick pancakes to. Because they all had similar stories to tell. And I would wonder in that moment, where was the justice for the least of these? The people who were hungry and thirsty, the strangers and the imprisoned. I wondered if God cared about them at all. It's the 1st century BCE, and Jesus begins his final lesson. But when the Son of Man comes in glory, he says, and all the angels with him, then he will sit upon his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered in his presence, and he will separate the people as a shepherd separates sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then these righteous ones will reply, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink, or a stranger and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And then the king will say, "I tell you the truth. When you did it for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it for me." And then the king will turn to those on his left, and he will say, away with you, you cursed ones, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his demons. For I was hungry, and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty, and you didn't give me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you didn't invite me into your home. I was naked, and you didn't give me any clothing. I was sick and in prison, and you didn't visit me. And then they will reply, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick in prison and not help you? And he will answer, I tell you the truth, when you refused to help the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were refusing to help me. And then they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous will go into eternal life. It's August 27, 2021. I'm now 34 years old, and I have been assigned to preach on Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46 for my ordination exams. And to be honest, it's not something that I look forward to. The passage has a lot of difficult language in it, all about judgment and hell and demons and separation, plus sheep and goats, and I know nothing about either of those things. And words, all of them, words that carry a lot of emotional baggage for me, a lot of spiritual baggage for me. See, I've wrestled with this idea of divine judgment for what seems like my entire life. First fearing, and then avoiding, and then ignoring the aspect of a God that would separate people as if they were nothing more than livestock. Sheep to the right, goats to the left. I know that the Gospel of Matthew is often called the Gospel of Justice because it consistently and constantly puts forth a day in which the righteous judge will come and pronounce final judgment on everyone by the same standard. And for many, the idea of justice is one to fear. It is an idea that has been used to browbeat people into faith for centuries. The idea that God is coming home like an angry, drunk father home from the factory, and that we'd all better behave under the threat of an eternal, fiery beatdown from our divine Father. But that is not the God that I have come to know throughout the Bible or history or reason or my experience. That is not the God that I know through the history of our story. It is a false God, one that paralyzes us out of fear, when the true God, the living God, is one that liberates us into movement through the Holy Spirit. And so I stopped talking about it. And so now how in the world will I talk to people about that God, about that judgment, just 5 days later? But here it is. In the book of Matthew. And now I am to preach on a passage that clearly states that God will judge the nations. And I am left wondering, how can this be the gospel? How can this be the good news of God? How can judgment ever be something that we look forward to? And then I think of Daniela and her two adorable daughters. And I think of Heidi and Carlos and Sulema and Melvita and all the people I spoke to at that church who came from places of injustice. I think of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Botham Jean and Michael Brown. I think of the men and women who were killed at the Pulse nightclub in Florida now 5 years ago. I think about the nearly 40% of people in the state of Arizona who have experienced domestic violence, and the 1 in 6 children who face hunger in our state each and every day. And then I realize that in those moments, I not only look forward to justice, I beg God for it. I realized then that I was naive when I thought that God didn't judge anyone or anything. Because the truth is that I believe in a God that hungers and thirsts for righteousness. Because I believe in a God that cares passionately about the suffering of the least of these. And if there is no judgment, it would mean that God didn't care about injustice and suffering. That God would not be willing to call out the evil systems and people that caused others harm. if there is no judgment, then there is no justice. Judgment is the act of exposing evil amongst and within us, which is necessary if Jesus is going to truly and finally redeem all things. If we believe in a God that is going to set all things right, both now and in the future, we must be willing to participate in the judgment of what is broken, both within us and outside of us. Judgment is part of the renewal of everything, the restoration of a creation that has been scarred by so much pain, whether we cause or ignore it. So much so that God sacrificed God's own self to show us a better way. It is the judgment of God that brings us out to protests and to marches. It is the judgment of God that causes us to cry out against injustice. It is the judgment of God that moves us to feed the hungry, to pushes us to give drink to the thirsty, and reveals to us a better world, a kingdom in which there is no more suffering, no more sickness, and no more pain. It is the justice of God and the judgment of God that shows us our own sin, the ways in which we participate in the systems that harm others, and shows us a better way. One in which there is no longer any harm to people, to creation, to ourselves, but help. In which we feed the hungry, give relief to the weary, and hospitality to the stranger. Not out of fear of some big bad punishment that our camp counselor tells us about. Not out of the threat of eternal torture, but out of the hope for a new and better and brighter tomorrow. And we will find that the very work that we were called to do, the thing that we will ultimately be judged on, the work of God, is the very thing that met us in our brokenness and has met the needs of a broken and suffering world. It turns out that judgment is the one thing, one of the very things that will save us. And to avoid it or try to ignore it is to accept the evil and injustice in this world as it is. But to see things for what they are, to call them out in our homes, in our workplaces, our churches, and in our world. Well, that is the beginning of the redemption of our world. And may it be so. Dear God, may it be so.